My name is Elliot Ball, and I'm going to be talking to you about the treatment of the defeated soldiers in 5th century Athens, or at least what we can get from that. So I'm going to focus mainly on the Battle of Epipoli. You don't really need to know the ins and outs of that, just that the Athenians lost, really. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the receptions of defeat and how it survives in epigraphy, and also how Thucydides presents it. Right. So just as a brief overview, I'm going to speed through this real quick. The Battle of Epipoli was a part of the Syracusan expedition that was launched after an appeal by an Athenian ally. Yeah. So basically, there'd been a series of defeats, resulting in a severe loss of men. And Nicias was the general, and Demosthenes is another general that arrives with a bunch of reinforcements. And in this quote here, he saw how things were and considered that it was impossible for him to let matters drift, and find himself in the same position Nicias had been in. For Nicias had appeared formidable enough when he first arrived, but then instead of attacking Syracuse at once, he spent the winter at Catana. So here Thucydides is doing what he tends to do, which is he provides like detailed reasoning behind each decision, even and especially when those military decisions end in defeat. We should be a little bit wary of this, I think, just because it's very psychologically appealing, but there isn't a lot of room for, yeah, stuff just happened, things went wrong, somebody came up with a bad plan, that sort of thing. The blame tends to be put on the politicians rather than the generals, perhaps because sort of implicitly the generals were under greater scrutiny and blame in Athenian society. So the story goes that the Athenians were doing really well. They were sort of really advancing on a garrison in Epipoli held by the Syracusans, and it was dark. They'd launched their attack at night, and they got cocky. Or at least that's how Thucydides explains it. And he talks a little bit about the difficulties of documenting war. So, and in fact, no one knows much more than what is going on around himself. But in a battle by night, how could anyone be sure of what happened exactly? There was a bright moon, but visibility was only what might be expected. So here he's sort of explaining not only some of the reasons why things went wrong. You can't see, they got disorganized, that sort of thing, but also some of the difficulties that he faces in portraying battle and war. And we also see a similar sentiment by Lysias. So indeed, because of their present fear, they thought that they saw many things they did not see, and that they heard many things that they did not hear. So it's that sort of fog of war sort of concept. And he goes on by constantly asking for the watchword. They had a watchword to identify themselves because it was dark, but they got disorganized, facing an organized line of Syracusans, and the watchword gets found out, basically. So one of the things that we might consider is that the Athenians at home, the non-combatants, might have said, well, how on earth could you have been so silly as to give out the watchword? So we can sort of guess from Thucydides' explanation that this was one of the things that people at home were curious about, or even angry about at the surviving soldiers for giving away the watchword. Why did you survive? And he is quite emotive. So, friend against friend and citizen against citizen. But here he's also emphasizing the Athenian narrative, which we'll go on to explore, of basically being Athenian, being a part of Athens, which we'll see in the commemorative practices. So commemoration, this is some of the description of how people back home sort of took the defeat, even though they were given information from the very soldiers who had been present at the event and had escaped. Still, they thought that this total destruction was something that could not possibly be true. So by Thucydides' explanation, in fact, he's sort of rationalizing to people back home that, yes, this is what happened, this is why it happened. Perhaps even reconciling some of the disbelief that many soldiers faced when they got back. And then the loss of so many hoplites, cavalry, and men of military age who they saw could not be replaced. They saw too that the number of ships in the docks were inadequate. So here it's sort of very unpersonal. It's not the men were killed and people were grieving. It's the soldiers were lost and the city needs to replace them. So here again, we get a very sort of almost nationalistic sort of explanation, concerns. It's not so much about the personal grief of how do people move on, how does society cope with such a loss of labor, what, that sort of thing. It's okay, where are our ships? Who's going to be our hoplites? So that's another thing that we could be wary of with Thucydides. So after any battle, after the season of war in the summer, in the winter, there would be a mass burial of the soldiers that died, and there would be these casualty lists that were erected. And they were erected immediately after the war season, and they always began with these men died in X war. So it was again, it was very much removed from the personal, and it both temporally because of how close it was to the actual event, and in terms of what was actually inscribed on it, it was very, very much focused on the event itself and removing that personhood. Ironically, considering it's a list of names. Another interesting thing about casualty list is that they describe the tribes from which each man is from, and they exclude the patronymics. So again, we're sort of limiting this idea of an individual as a person within a family, and more as a part of a tribe that is a part of Athens. Um, so yeah, they were notably large, like they were unavoidable when you entered the cemetery. They were like in your face. They're quite big. Um, and so because of this sort of framing, it sort of facilitated almost the forgetting of defeat, despite the fact that that's what it was commemorating. Just because the rhetoric around it, the repeated monuments of the casualty list, it sort of created this imagery of like continuity. There was always this continuous battle, and sometimes they had fewer names, and sometimes they had more. So is this idea of almost competition that Arrington goes into a lot about how it was sort of framed under this idea of agon. So competition and continuous struggle rather than success and victory and defeat. Um, yeah, this is just a translation of the casualty list on the previous slide. Again, as you see, of the tribes also includes foreigners. Again, what was emphasized, not necessarily people's families, people's individual context, but rather their context in respect to Athens. How did they serve Athens? That was the thing that was being commemorated. So yeah, sort of a different idea of Thucydides. Instead of reading him as like a pure sort of military um source, instead of looking, oh, how accurate, how much can we trust this, because he is giving those sort of psychologically appeasing sort of explanations of events. Foster actually suggests we shift that and instead look more at how we can look at him to see the sort of things, the sort of questions that soldiers were asked by people at home. How do his explanations serve to rationalize events for people? How does that help with their grief? Thucydides perhaps played quite an instrumental role in that. So yeah. Um, and overall, um, What about shame? Because often soldiers that survive are shamed. And this was certainly the fact in Athens. Whilst the defeated and the dead got commemorated on the list as servicemen of Athens, what happened to the people that survived? Well, according to Thucydides, anyway, they were interrogated and met with disbelief at the events that they told. Um, Perhaps walking memories of shame in Athens itself. And Arrington and Foster both sort of have a similar sort of narrative of the uh, commemoration practices actually serve to minimize the memory of defeat. So it's like, oh, we've got it here, and Arrington, I think, specifically talks about the epigrams as facilitating the forgetting of defeat by reframing it in terms of continuous struggle, by having like so occasionally like multiple of the same names. The remembrance of the individual was lost in the face of the event. So yeah. um it is kind of difficult to construct how receptions occurred, just because like this occurred in 415 BCE, and like the 415 BCE in the winter to the following 414 BCE, specific sources from that period, just it doesn't survive substantially that we can sort of reconstruct sort of accurately receptions to a specific battle. But I hope by looking at the commemoration lists and how Thucydides' explanations sort of tie into um, the narratives of defeat in Athenian society, we can sort of get a broader idea of how surviving soldiers might have been treated and how defeat was sort of commemorated. So yeah, thank you very much for listening to me babble. I hope I didn't go on too long. And yeah, well, thank you.